Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this evening, The Mysteries of Migration, with the wonderful Bob Bell back here joining us with Burlington Green. We are so happy and grateful that all of you were able to join us. So on behalf of Burlington Green, I just wanted to start the evening by extending our gratitude for all of you for being here and for tuning in. And of course, to Bob for compiling all of this research and this information and being willing to share it with all of us this evening. So thank you so much for all of you for being here. This webinar tonight is part of our Nature Friendly Burlington program through Burlington Green. And that program is all about connecting people to local green spaces, to the wonderful, miraculous benefits of connecting with nature, as well as some different stewardship opportunities that are available here in Burlington. We always like to start any of our evenings, or any of our events really, with a land acknowledgement. So I just wanted to begin our evening with that. All right, folks, 1 second. Beautiful. So we do have an official land acknowledgement statement for Burlington Green, which I will read in just a moment. But I also really like to share whenever I have the possibility this map, because I really enjoy this as a resource for anybody who hasn't used it or seen it before. You can see right down here is the website that you can go down to see it, and it's native-land.ca. And pretty much anywhere you are in the world, you can type in your location and you get a map just like this, and it shows you a history of Indigenous communities and societies that inhabited that area. And one of the reasons I like to share it as much as I can and as much as possible is just because of the learning that I had once I saw a map like this. There's a few things we're not traditionally used to seeing, at least I wasn't, that there are not really traditional borders on this map. And one of the things I realized is that even though I completed my compulsory education in the province of Ontario, my understanding before seeing a map like this was that North America was not a very populated place before colonization. And tools like this, I think, are really important as a inspiration for us to rethink our knowledge, or maybe lack of knowledge, and do a little bit more research and reflection on maybe the missing gaps of information, or what else we could do to reflect on the information we might not have and what assumptions that might lead to. So hopefully this inspires some thought and reflection from all of you. And our land acknowledgement goes as such. In Burlington, our work with the community takes place within the treaty lands and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we recognize this land as being home and the traditional territory to the Indigenous people since time immemorial. We honor all past and present First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, and we recognize their leadership in protecting and caring for Mother Earth. We join them in honoring and respecting the land, waters, plants, animals, four directions, and all of the wonderful elements of creation that exist. Burlington Green has much to learn from Indigenous people, and we encourage everyone to continually learn from and about the Indigenous community where you live, and how we can each meaningfully honor the calls to action for truth and reconciliation. Thank you so much, everyone. So I wanted to cover quickly the Zoom features, and I have mentioned it briefly before, but just again, a reminder that we are recording tonight's evening, and a hello to everybody watching this on YouTube in the future, the present for you. Just a reminder, if you could stay muted. So that's a feature which we're all sort of familiar, and all of us are muted right now. And if you just try and remain muted throughout the evening, and to make sure you have your video off, because if you do turn your video off, there is a chance you might show up in the recording. So just be careful to make sure that your videos stay off for tonight. And a little tip for just the best viewing experience is you'll see in the top right of your screen, there's these options in the drop-down menu. And we recommend people stick to the speaker section, because that way anyone who's speaking shows up alongside the rest of the presentation that you'll see. And also, if you do the hide non-video participants, that way you'll just see whoever's speaking and the presentation and the other wonderful folks that we're sharing the evening with will not show up on your screen, so you get the best viewing experience. We also invite people to ask questions in the chat, knowing that we received a good amount of questions in your registrations, and we have submitted those all to Bob in advance, and he has actually answered a lot of those questions. So a lot of them are answered in his presentation. We will go through as many of them as we can in the evening.
And it's unmuted.
We'll go through as many of them as we can throughout the evening. But don't worry if your question is not answered, because we will be sending out a post-event email. And in that email, it'll have the actual written questions and answers to all of those questions. So if your chat question does not get submitted and answered today, if we don't pick it up and answer it right now, Bob has kindly offered to answer those questions after our session, and we will include that in the post-event email that goes out. So feel free to write your questions, and if we don't have time, the answer will come and everybody will get the benefit of witnessing those questions as well.
Okay.
Wonderful. So what's next? We have some poll questions to get started, just to get everybody a little bit more engaged. So I'm going to launch those polls right now. So we have 3 questions. The first one is really simple. It's just asking where you're joining us from today, and we have a few options there. We also have the question number 2, if you scroll through to the next question, of how many folks are watching via your screen tonight. So we saw from one of our wonderful friends, they have their grandson Noah. If you have one person, if you have 2 people, if there's a whole party of you watching, let us know. That's just really great, cool information for us to know who is joining us today and how many of them. And then we have a skill testing question for number 3. And it says, which of these birds is known for migrating through Burlington in large numbers each year? And we have the options of the monarch butterfly, snowy owl, tundra swan, or the sandhill crane. So I'll give everyone about 30 seconds to answer the questions as best as they can, and then I will end the poll and share the results with everyone. I feel like I should have got some Jeopardy music to play in the background while all of you are answering. And I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds. Thanks so much to everyone who's answered so far. Okay. And I'll share the results. It looks like most of you are coming in from Burlington, so welcome, and that means our land acknowledgement was still perfectly relevant for all of you. Cool, there is someone from Niagara Falls coming in. We have Mississauga, Oakville, Hamilton, Toronto, and there's 8 others, so I'd be really interested to find out what cities you guys are zooming in from. Feel free to write it in the chat, actually, and introduce yourselves. It looks like most of us are watching solo, but there's 8 of us with a party in our houses watching this. So hopefully you enjoy this all together. And then, so the answers, it is actually the tundra swan. The monarch butterfly was a little bit of a trick question because it is not a bird. So even though they do migrate through Burlington, the answer is the tundra swan. And tundra swans, you can notice from their orange bills, and trumpeter swans actually have black bills. As a little easy tip on how to tell the difference between the swans. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating in that. And without further ado, I would love to bring to the screen the wonderful Bob Bell. So Bob has joined us to share his passions for birds a few times now, and we're so excited to welcome him back. Bob spent 35 years as a mineral exploration geologist before retiring to Ancaster in 2015. He quickly discovered that the area, with its multitude of habitats and environments, was really fantastic for birding. Bob's passionate about sharing the joy of birding with people of all skill levels and enjoys introducing them to the huge variety of beautiful birds that can be seen in the Hamilton and Burlington areas. He hopes that his passion will inspire others to take in the sights and sounds of nature that surround us, and that this interest will translate into support and protection for local birds. Without further ado, I will pass the screen over to the reason we are all here tonight, the wonderful Bob Bell.
Thanks, Gail. No, people are here for the birds. It's very humbling and gratifying to see so many people, with an interest in birds. So thank you all. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before I get into it. You'll see a number of bird photos. They're all taken by me, unless otherwise indicated. And as Gail has already mentioned, if you're worried about trying to take notes, because I do have some slides with recommendations for books or links to websites. Don't worry about that. They'll be included in the handout that Kale and I will create as a PDF file and that you'll all receive. And then another housekeeping issue, obviously, is to thank Kale and Burlington Green for once again giving me their platform. I think this is the 5th or 6th time that I've been given this honor to share my passion for birds and to connect with people. And I also want to give a shout out to Birds Canada. I'm still just in shock that they were very kind enough. They're based down in Port Rowan and Lake Erie, all top ornithologists, and they invited me to drive down and present my talk to them last week and critique it. So I had it vetted by some professional ornithologists, and big thanks to them. So I titled the talk, "Now You See Me, Now You Don't." And that's because twice a year, we're lucky to witness this amazing spectacle. In the fall, birds disappear and we don't see them until spring, and all of a sudden, mysteriously, they're back. And conversely, in the fall, you may get a few new birds appearing. They hang around all winter, and then they're gone in the spring. So, it's amazing how many cartoons you can find where the doofus is named Bob. And to be honest, I could probably give a whole slideshow just of the cartoons I saved with Bob. But this one in particular made me laugh. Looks like Bob is leading the flock again, and I hope I don't lead you astray. Birds are putting on this amazing show all around us. Locally, we have roughly 150 species breeding here in the summer. And during migration periods, we can have up to about 300 species passing through. So I hope when I'm done, I hope you'll have a greater appreciation for what super feats these birds are accomplishing, and come to realize that if someone calls you a bird brain, take it as a compliment. So a little bit of the history of understanding of bird migration. Our ancestors and ancients had some pretty wild ideas. They thought songbirds were hitching rides on the back of storks. Aristotle thought swallows were hibernating in cracks and crevices in trees, and he even thought some birds sort of transmogrified into hardier species that were better adapted to get through the winter. And this was sort of fact for hundreds and hundreds of years. In 1703, there was an English minister that wrote that migrating birds were flying to the moon. And a Swedish priest thought the swallows were hibernating in the mud at the bottom of lakes and rivers, which kind of makes sense given that turtles do that and frogs do that. And that was persisted well into the 1800s. But the thinking really started to change in the late 1700s. And that's when Europe was being imperialistic and colonizing, and there were sailors all over the world, and they were returning to Europe from Africa and reporting they'd seen swallows there. So maybe that's where they were going, and that wasn't to the moon or to the bottom of the lakes. And then the big game changer was this poor, unfortunate stork. In 1822, it was found alive on the coast of what is now Germany. It had been impaled by the spear that was about 3/4 of a meter long. And when they examined the spear, it was from wood from an African origin. So notwithstanding that it was wounded and carrying the spear, that stork had flown about 3,000 kilometers from Africa. And then they went and killed it and stuffed it. And so the poor thing, it's on display in the University of Rostock in Germany. So, what is migration? The word is derived from the Latin word migratus, which means to change. And what's changing? Well, it refers to the birds changing their geographic location from season to season. But not all birds do that. Some are permanent year-round residents. And some birds migrate only very short distances. some long distances, and some are actually altitudinal migrants. They're just moving up and down elevation wise. Now, migration is dangerous, it's energy intensive. So why do so many birds bother? The Clash's famous song, Should I Stay or Should I Go, really summarizes it well. But it's not about getting out of the cold. Birds can handle cold as long as they get food. I took this shot of a chickadee at Algonquin Park one January morning, and it was about -20. It's all about finding food. That's the primary goal of migration, is finding food sources. There are secondary goals like finding nesting sites, and studies have shown that the further north a bird migrates to nest, the less risk of nest predation there is. Okay, so many of our birds, back to the food issue, many of our birds make a living on eating flying or moving insects. Well, there's not a lot of those around in a good Canadian winter, especially after the one we've had and are still having these days. So they have no choice but to go somewhere else to find their food. And the same concept applies to birds that eat fish. For example, osprey and herons, like this great blue heron that's trying to choke down this massive fish, and kingfishers. Once their waterway is frozen, they have to go south. And what about woodpeckers? Let's look at them, for example. We have 6 species that are fairly common around here. The top 4 are here year round, but the 2 in the bottom row migrate. So the pileated in the top, the look-alike smaller downy and larger hairy, and the red-bellied are here year round. I deliberately chose, pictures, the top 2 right ones in winter, just to show they are here in the winter. Red bellies do a little bit of migration, sort of quasi, they roam, but they're here year round. But the bottom 2 migrate, and why is that? Well, flickers are ant specialists. They eat ants, and here's one probing ants in my backyard. So once the ground is frozen, they have no choice but to move on. And likewise, sapsuckers drill sap holes in trees, and they drink the sap, and they use it basically like a fly sticker, and get the bugs that get trapped in the sap. So once the trees stop flowing sap in the winter, they have to migrate as well. So that begs the question, well, why not just stay further south where you've got reliable food all year round? And the answer is, once again, food, except now we're talking mega food. Every spring in the Northern Hemisphere, there's an enormous explosion of protein in the form of insects, like literally billions of tons. Anybody that's been camping in Northern Ontario knows only too well about black flies and mosquitoes. And so you combine that a massive amount of food and the longer daylight that you get, the further north you go, so longer time to forage and eat those insects. Those birds can raise more chicks per year, 4 to 6 on average, than birds that are stay at home in the tropics. They only raise 2 to 3. So there is an evolutionary advantage there. And insects are the first line in converting plant material to protein. And 95% of all young birds need insect protein. So basically, the birds are traveling further to get cheap food and lodging. The trip isn't easy, but the deals are worth it. And with migration, birds are essentially getting 2 summers, and some never experience a true winter. So who migrates and what is triggering this? There are roughly between 10 and 11,000 species of birds in the world, and about 40% of them, or 4,000 species, are migratory. In Canada, we have about 400 species, but our rate is higher. About 75% of our birds are migratory, and that makes sense, just given how far north we are. So the big trigger on migration is the changing length of daylight. That changes their brains, and it triggers hormones, which leads to physiological changes in their body that increases their ability and their desire to migrate. For example, some of their internal organs will shrink in size, including their brains and their gonads, so they have room to put on the fat and fuel that they're going to need for their long trips. And during migration periods, even cage birds that were originally migratory birds, they get very fidgety during migration time, and they get very active at night. and they may repeatedly, try to move and flutter towards that side of the cage in the direction they want to go. And trusted Germans actually have a word just for this, Zugenruhe, which means movement restlessness. Now this cartoon I just want to point out because it's by Rosemary Moscow. She's originally from, I think it's Ottawa. She's Canadian, and she does a cartoon series called Bird and Moon, and they're very educational and they're very entertaining. And I recommend you look her up. And in this one, there's two birds having a little chat. I'm so antsy lately. I wonder what that means. Oh, it means you're about to fly thousands of perilous miles over land and sea. Ah, that's preposterous. Oh, no, it's true. We'll see about that. And later that night, well, darn, off they go. So there's two types of migrants. We can basically lump migrating birds into two broad categories. One are called obligate migrants. And just think of the word obliged. So these birds are hardwired, it's genetic, it's innate. The second category is called facultative. And you can, think of the word faculties. So they're using their faculties, they're thinking about it. They have choices to make. And of course, these are the two extremes, and many birds will fit in between these extremes. And in general, the obligate ones that are hardwired are long distance migrants. The ones that are thinking about it more are short to intermediate migrants. So the obligate ones, like I say, are hardwired. They're triggered by the length of daylight rather than the local weather. They're very predictable. They're really running like clockwork on a schedule. They will leave in the fall when it's time to go, and they're triggered, even if the conditions haven't started to deteriorate, and even if there's still lots of food around. And like I say, it's long distance, usually to the same wintering grounds. Then this type of migration is really beneficial for what we call hatchier birds, the baby birds that were just born this year. They're making the trip for the first time into an unknown area, but it's all wired into their brains. So many of our songbirds are in this group. The facultative migrants, they're triggered by a mix of the length of the daylight, but also by the local conditions such as food and weather. So they can vary their time of departure and how far they go. And it's usually not so far. They can be flexible, and depending on the food supply, they may go later in the year. Some years they may not go at all. And they can certainly linger longer than the obligate migrants that, they wake up one day and get this urge to go. They may not migrate at all, like I say, and that includes, some of our birds like this are robins, bluebirds, and starlings. We all think robins all migrate, but they don't. Some of them decide to stay, and I find both robins and bluebirds, the ones that do overwinter, tend to form flocks, and that's probably for safety and numbers, that they can roam around and find food sources in the winter, such as berries. The short distance migrants, some of them, their entire migration is within the confines of Canada. So these might be birds that are breeding in the boreal forests in northern Ontario or up in the Arctic, and they come down and they think southern Ontario and Burlington is a mild, tropical winter for them, and they overwinter here. And examples of these are dark-eyed juncos. They breed in the boreal forest. They come down fairly early in the fall. You can see this one in my backyard. Obviously, the leaves were still on the trees and turned color. Other examples are snow buntings and some ducks. The short distance altitudinal migrants are ones that move up and down elevation in mountainous areas, depending on the seasons. Now, this is a photo that I did not take, Clark's nutcracker, a West Coast bird. I took this from Cornell's website. About 20% of North American land birds undergo this altitudinal migration. And not surprisingly, it's mostly West Coast birds because that's where our mountains are. And these Clark's nutcrackers, they can be anywhere from 300 meters to 3.6 kilometers up, depending on the time of year. The more well-known migrants are the long-distance obligate ones. They breed here, but they go, to the southern U.S. or the Caribbean or Central America, all the way to South America. And these include, many of our warblers, flycatchers, hummingbirds, And this beautiful scarlet tanager that one spring, I mean, they're not feeder birds, but it elected to refuel at my feeders. So, you can see where we get them here, and they go down to South America. Now, this is a really cool animation. You can see from Cornell. And once they start it, you'll see it's a calendar year, and this is starting in January, where they're down in South America on their wintering grounds. And you'll see over the course of the year, you see them starting to work their way up. We're in the March, and then all the way to June, July, they're up here in northern Canada, and then they turn and head their way back, and then by the end of the year, they're back. Another example of a long distance migrant is the bobolink. Our grassland birds, one of the longest trips of any of our songbirds. They travel about 8,000 kilometers from farmland here to the pampas of Argentina. Now, how did this long distance migration come to be? And there's been two competing hypotheses amongst ornithologists: a northern home versus a southern home. So the northern home theory is that these birds that we see here are our birds. They originated and evolved here, and they started migrating further and further south and over time. And once they got down to the tropics, some of them lost their migration traits and just stayed, and then radiated out into the diversity of tropical birds that we have today. The southern home hypothesis is that during the ice age, a lot of the birds were basically confined down to the tropics because the glaciers were covering much of North America. But as the glaciers retreated, these birds were expanding their range, but then winter would come and they would backtrack. And then, over time that they just kept expanding further and further north till they're coming up here. So the trip became longer and longer, but like I say, it was worth it because of all the food. Well, it turns out both theories are correct depending on the species. It seems like migration has evolved more commonly in birds that we could consider our birds, such as shorebirds, ducks, and warblers. And everybody knows I love warblers, and yet they are our birds, which is kind of weird because they're only here like about 4 months of the year, and most of the majority of the year they've gone south. And here's an example of black-birding warbler, one of my favorites. Here's its ancestral breeding range. And in the wintering range, you can see it expanding further and further south until its current wintering range. Okay. So that's the northern home. But Baltimore Orioles originated down in the tropics, and there's their ancestral home. They started expanding their range, just like I talked about. And now they come all the way up here to breed and go down here to the blue to overwinter. Are there any differences between the birds that are sort of permanent residents here and the migrants? And there are. Most migrants have longer, more tapered, pointed wings, and those are good for flying really long distances. And surprisingly, migrants typically have smaller brains proportionate to their body size. And the theory is that brains are big, they're heavy, they're energy consuming. Perhaps it's just too much work to lug a big brain thousands of kilometers. And then research has shown that the larger brains of our stay-at-home birds helps them deal with all the different challenges. I mean, they have to deal with 4 different seasons and changing all the time. So maybe they need that brain power. And a good example is birds that stash seeds for later retrieval in the winter. And these could include the chickadees, Canada jays, and those Clark's nutcrackers that I showed from the West Coast. In the fall, the hippocampus, which is the part of our brains too that processes spatial information and memory, expands by about 30%, and that allows them to remember where those seeds are. Chickadees can store up to 80,000 seeds in the season and find them all. It's incredible. Does an early spring mean an early return? Well, it depends on which category of migrants we're talking about. No, for obligate long distance migrants. That, for example, that bobolink that's down in the pampas of the Argentinas in Argentina, he has no idea that spring came early up here. He's coming on a hardwired schedule, and he's just going to go when he's ready to go. Now, the birds do follow resource availability as they come north. Shorebirds will queue into vegetation and marshes. Songbirds are basically following leaf out as they come further and further north. And with leaf out comes bugs. And so these ones, as I've said, they're very consistent. And rose-breasted grosbeaks, like this beauty at my feeders, they arrive about May 3rd as their median arrival date. And they're very consistent. But if you're a facultative migrant, an early spring may mean an early return. They haven't gone so far south. They're better positioned to take advantage of that earlier weather. They're almost here. Like red-winged blackbirds, they may be overwintering just on the other side of the Great Lakes or a little bit further south. So I've heard them singing in my neighborhood as early as late February, and they're usually all back by mid-March, the males at least. Now, fall migration, again, in this case, it's decreasing daylight instead of increasing, is a primary trigger for both categories of the migrants. But the actual timing of when they leave is going to be dictated by what they eat. You can combine or categorize birds as insectivores, omnivores, which is a mixed balanced diet between insects and protein and berries and seeds and whatnot. And then some birds are what I call switch hitters. They're insectivores that can switch over to omnivores once the bugs are gone. Facultative migrants like ducks can linger as long as there's open water. And I've often been asked, "Oh, well, I've got my feeders out, and maybe I'm interfering with the birds. I'm holding them back, and interfering with their migration instinct." Birds are happy to desert your feeders when it's time to go. So just relax and enjoy them. And all of a sudden, one day they're not going to be there. So the insectivores, which includes my beloved warblers and vireos, yes, they're triggered by the shortening days. But then once those insects start to fade in late summer, that's when they head south. And that's typically late August. Migration's on, it's going well in late August to mid-September. Shorebirds start coming down actually in July, late July from the Arctic. Now the omnivores, these are the birds, like I say, that eat a balanced diet, insect, fruits, seeds. For example, sparrows, like this little chipping sparrow. They're not forced out of their breeding grounds because the bugs ran out. And so they can linger well into the fall, maybe even into November. And they have the luxury of really timing their trip. They can wait for a nice tailwind and a nice clear night. And then the switch hitters, these are birds that can process fruit and seeds on top of the insects. They can migrate more like the omnivores. They can be flexible and linger late into the fall. And examples of these are hermit thrush, phoebes, yellow-rumped warblers, and red-eyed vireos. So how many birds are traveling? Let's just look at the Canadian border. Numbers are staggering. Every spring, there's roughly 2.5 billion birds coming back into Canada. It's amazing. And in the fall, outbound is about 4 billion. And why so many more? Well, that's all the babies, the hatch year birds, and that's the ones that have survived and made it to fledge and going south. So up to now, I've been talking about the time of year when birds are migrating. What about the actual time of day? 80% of birds that migrate in North America do it at night. And this is primarily the songbirds. And why is that? Well, there's actually a number of reasons. Number one is if you're flying all day, flapping your wings under a blazing sun, you're going to overheat. It takes a lot of energy to keep regulate your core temperature. So they don't want to expend that extra energy trying to regulate themselves. It's cooler at night. It's better to fly then. Plus, the atmosphere isn't as turbulent. So there's smoother skies. There's fewer predators like hawks and falcons. I mean, they can't be eating at night, so you might as well travel. And navigate by stars. Birds do navigate by stars. Now, they don't have a pattern of constellations in their head, but they do learn when they're sitting on the nest that they see over the course of a night, they see the stars rotating around Polaris, the North Star. So they learn that that is north and they need to fly in the opposite direction to be south. So birds can get confused on really cloudy nights and they can go off course. Now, when they're migrating at night, they're not quiet. They are talking to each other. It's called call notes. And these act as sort of an anti-collision alarm, because there can be millions of birds and they don't want to run into each other. And they get louder and more frequent towards dawn when they start to drift down, looking for a place to stay, spend the day and refuel. So they drift down from, typical cruising altitude of 150 to 600 meters. Some are higher, up to a couple thousand meters, and they get more vocal. Now, if your hearing is better than mine, if you go out during migration, you can hear them. People with good hearing say, and they can actually identify them by their call notes. You might not see them, but you can hear them going over. But if there happens to be a full moon during migration, go out with your binoculars and train it on the moon, and you may see little black blips going by as birds are streaming past the moon. Now, birds that migrate in the day, or diurnal migration, are typically the raptors, and that's because they're taking advantage of unique wind conditions that have occurred over the day because of daytime heating, such as thermals, which rising air, which gives them a free lift, so they can flat glide a long way like these migrating turkey vultures. So they minimize their energy. The downside to this is that they can't take shortcuts across big bodies of water like the Gulf of Mexico because there's no thermals out there. So raptors have to contour. They follow around the Great Lakes shorelines, down the coastal areas of continents. There's no shortcuts for them, but they're saving energy. Some other birds that migrate during the day, for example, are hummingbirds. They might do a bit at night, but they mostly do it during the day. That's when their refueling stations are open, flowers. And I gather that they just can't pack on enough food to bulk up to go all day. So they're forced to stop and maybe refuel a bit and then carry on. Some songbirds will migrate both at night and during the day. Blue jays, if you watch carefully in the fall, you can see massive flocks of blue jays going over. And people down at Birds Canada told me it's probably so that they can, going in the daytime, they can share information about food sources and whatnot, or the weather, talking to each other. So now I'd like to go over a few terms that you might have heard, migration terms, and one of them is fallout. So a fallout is this rare occasion when a great number of birds suddenly hit conditions that force them to the ground, that they have to land in the same location all at once. They're just exhausted. And the most typical case of this is spring migration. Those long distance migrants, they don't know what they're getting into, and they're coming north and they go smack into a cold front coming down from the north with strong winds. And they just can't fight the winds and they all have to land at once. This is a photo from a lighthouse on the east coast of Canada, and these are just all warblers. And you can see in the background here, there's other photos, there's just literally hundreds of them. Now, if this happened when they're out over a big body of water, it's very sad, but there's going to be mass casualties. They're just exhausted and they have to land, they're going to drown. But if they make it to land, it is the most spectacular thing for birders. In 2019, there was a huge fallout at Point Pelee during spring migration. And friends of mine talked about hundreds of warblers on the ground, literally crawling over their feet. And a friend of mine, Nancy Barrett, was kind enough to share this photo and allow me to use it of a couple of Blackburnian warblers, one of my favorites, right at her feet. Another term you might have heard is eruptions. And, that's not ER, it's IRR. Eruptive migrants are birds from the Arctic or boreal regions that are typically year-round permanent residents up there and don't necessarily migrate. But they occasionally erupt into lower latitudes because of food sources. So the best example are what we call winter finch that depend on variable crops of tree seeds like birch, alder, and spruce cones. And those tend to be very cyclical. So there's years where the cone crop is very poor, and those winter finch will come south, like red poles, grosbeaks, and crossbills. Snowy owls are eruptive species, but for actually the opposite reason. They love their lemmings. They eat lemmings. Well, the lemming population is also very cyclical. And when there's a lot of lemmings, the snowy owls do very well reproductively and have a lot of babies. And so the next year is they erupt south because they've had too much food. And so there's too many snowy owls competing up north. So they'll spread out and come south. And just a couple of examples of eruptions. Evening grosbeaks, one of the winter finch. This range map here, the purple is their year-round permanent residence. You can see it's the boreal forests. In the summer, they'll go a little bit even further north in the orange. But in an eruptive year, they'll come down into the blue or even further south. And in the fall of 2022, there was a huge eruption of evening grosbeaks. And I never dreamt that I would see these in my backyard here in Ancaster. And I was blessed with about 2 dozen of them for 3 days. I even, I posted this, and I was even approached by ornithologists in France that were doing a study of this, and they wanted to use pictures from my backyard, which was kind of cool. So this was October 2022. In the winter of 2021, there was a similar eruption of redpolls, and they breed even further north. You can see in the summer, they're up here, right in the tundra, right up Baffin Island. They're over in Greenland, year round, all the way up here in the purple. But in an eruptive year, they come down. That winter, I had up to 50 redpolls in my backyard for several months. It was just spectacular. Another term you may hear is vagrants. So a vagrant is a bird that's been found way outside of its normal range. And this often happens in the fall when there's lots of young birds making their first ever trip. And people would normally think, okay, they just got blown off course, they got caught up in a windstorm. Yes, that's true for some, but most vagrants started off in the wrong direction. Perhaps the hard wiring of that navigational direction was not correct, or they made a mistake. So if you're heading south and you're off by 20 degrees and you're only going 100 kilometers, well, it doesn't really matter. It's not a huge difference. But if you're going thousands of kilometers, you are way out of range, and it could be fatal. I mean, this is a flycatcher from Brazil that was in Whitby a few years ago. So now we're getting into the really fun bit, the navigation, how they navigate. And one of the questions emailed in was, do birds return to their same nesting site? Some birds do have what's called high site fidelity, and they will return to the same nesting box every year. And yet they'll go south to, let's say Central America, and sleep in the same tree in Central America, and they go back and forth. So, very mysterious. And first year birds, they're making the trip on their own. Quite often in many species, the adults head out weeks before the babies. I don't know why. And somehow those birds find their winter home, and despite never having seen it, and they return to where they were born. So this is the biggest unknown, navigation, and it is complicated. So number one, it's hardwired. Innate genetics, they inherit the direction you're supposed to head towards. Studies have shown if a bird is an offspring of parents with two different directions, that the babies will go sort of in an intermediate direction. And in their first trip south, the young birds are following those inherited instructions. But if they do make a mistake, or if they do get blown off course, they generally can't recover from it. So only about 30% of small songbirds actually survive that first migration south and back. But if they do survive it, they've built up a map in their brain to navigate. And the odds go up from 30% to about 50% as adults of making the trip. So just think about the birds we see. The odds are still only about 50-50 of making the trip every year. So, how do they navigate? One way is with visual cues. I'm sure many of you have seen maps like this before of so-called flyways. And North America, for example, is divided into 4 flyways, one up and down each coast, one up the Great Plains, and one that's basically centered on the Mississippi River and comes through Ontario. So who uses this? Waterfowl, ducks, geese, swans, cranes. And what they're following is habitat that they like. big farmland, marshes, waterways, very consistent habitat on their flyways. Some use social cues like the famous V shape of migrating geese. And I'm not sure if this cartoon on the left shows very well because the font is quite faint, but here's the leader of the Canada geese saying, well, where are we going? And another one says, well, we're following you. And then the look on his face is like, dope. They also navigate with invisible cues. Surprisingly, many species of birds have very good senses of smell. And they can often tell by smell that, oh, I've been here before. They're what's called odor landscapes. And these are volatile chemicals that are stable and persistently stable over big areas, regardless of the wind, the season, or the weather. And birds can also hear infrasound, very, very low frequency sounds that we can't hear, generated, for example, by ocean surf, tectonic activity, volcanism, or wind blowing through mountain passes. And I read one sort of poetic speculation that if you're a bird heading down the Great Plains, you can hear the Atlantic out of your ear to the left, you can hear the Pacific to the right, and you can hear the volcanoes in Mexico straight ahead. Might be a bit of a stretch, but now we're getting into the really fun, cool part. Don't ask any questions, please. Using the Earth's magnetic field. Just a little bit about it. So at the poles, the magnetic field is vertical, but if you're at the equator, that magnetic field is flat, like in this cartoon you can see. So that changing inclination from vertical to flat, that can indicate your latitude. Now, the magnetic field is very weak. It's 10 to 100 times weaker than a fridge magnet. Now, the birds, a lot of them have magnetite crystals in their beaks. And it used to be that people thought, scientists thought, oh, this is how they're using the magnetic field somehow with these crystals. But then they discovered those magnetic crystals aren't connected to their brain. So we don't know why they're there. Maybe they're vestigial leftover, evolutionary leftover from dinosaurs or something. We just don't know. So how do they do it? Well, they have a superpower using quantum physics. And believe me, it's complicated. I'm not sure if I can even explain it properly. But subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field, that change in inclination, somehow affects chemical reactions in a light sensing protein in their eyes. And at the subatomic level, electrons get entangled. It's what Einstein called spooky interaction at a distance. And they become a million times more sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field through this quantum entanglement. So it's almost like they can put on a pair of glasses and see the contours of the Earth's magnetic field. Now, obviously, we don't know what the birds are really seeing. Maybe what they're really seeing is a bright light in the north and south skies that fades to a fainter light east-west. So they can line up in that. We don't really know. So, it may be that if they fly up into a tree at sunset, watching the sun go down, they're almost like calibrating as the Earth's magnetic field is coming online as it gets dark and they get tuned into it. Now, we don't really know how they know their longitude, east-west location. It's speculation is it's either memory or a combination, and just using prominent visual cues, like landforms or, oh, that big river has to be to my left and the mountains to the right. And just to prove that they really are using a magnetic field during big geomagnetic storms, for example, a night with northern lights, the vagrancy rate can double. So it messes them up. Now, okay, so I talked about how the waterfowl are following those clear flyways. Well, songbirds aren't tied to single habitats like those waterfowl. So, they can fan out and migrate all the way, across the continent. They're not restricted to a certain range. But what studies have shown, once tracking became a possibility, the songbird's northbound route in the spring is often further west than when they're going south. In the south, they're often further east, even right out to over the Atlantic Ocean. So it's basically, what they call a migration loop. sort of a clockwise loop. And why are they doing this? They're taking advantage of stronger prevailing tailwinds or lesser headwinds at those times of year. So they're minimizing the headwind and getting free lift. So birds are very, very clever. And a great example of this is the blackpoll warbler. And I've actually shown this before in my warbler talk. Warblers breed in the boreal forests all the way from Newfoundland over to Alaska, here in the red. But when it comes time to go south in the fall, the ones in Alaska, for example, don't just head down over North America like this. They all come to the East Coast, and anywhere from Nova Scotia down to about New Jersey, where they fatten up. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then after they fattened up, they head out over the Atlantic, and they fly for roughly 80 hours, 4 nights and 3 days nonstop. They're traveling about 3,200 kilometers. They can be as high as 3.6 kilometers. It's the longest flight over water of any songbird. During this trip, they're going to lose 50% of their body weight. And if they were a car burning gas, they're getting about 750 miles to the gallon. And this is all in a bird that weighs roughly 12 to 13 grams before fattening up. So with the weight of 2 nickels. And here's their migration loop. So they're going down over the Atlantic, but they come back up in a more direct route in the fall, or in the spring, sorry. So this is what a blackpoll warbler looks like in breeding plumage when they're coming north. And I already talked about how migrating birds typically have longer, more pointed wings than stay-at-home birds. Well, the blackpoll warbler's got the longest migration of any warbler. Well, guess what? They have the longest wings proportional to their body size of any warbler. So when they get to that East Coast I was talking about, pre-migration, liver enzymes kick in and help them bulk up like crazy. They can double their weight in about 72 hours. So that 12, 13 grams goes to 20, 25 grams. And apparently they are obese, like they would be coronary patients, but it doesn't hurt them. They need that fuel because they're going to lose it all on the trip. So you see what he looks like in the spring, same bird. There's what they look like in the fall. So that's breeding plumage versus non-breeding plumage. So like I've already talked about as well, there's some body parts they don't need on the trip shrink. So their brains, the parts of their brain that are used for song, they're not singing out there, and their gonads shrink so they can put on all that extra weight. But they ramp up their hemoglobin, they double their oxygen-rich red blood cells, and this helps them metabolize when they're up 3.5 kilometers above the earth. And once they fatten up after those 2, 3, 4 days of it, they head out over the Atlantic, and it's just a total leap of faith for the next 80 hours. It's now you see why only 50% make it as adults. It's incredible. So how do we know all this about migration? Let's get in a bit about the technology. Historically, the only tool was banding, where they put little metal rings with some information stamped in it around their leg. Or in Europe or England, it's called ringing. And this started about 1899. The problem with banding is, okay, so you banded the bird at point A, and if you're lucky enough to catch him at point B, he's there. You have no idea the route he took, and you have to catch him. And the success rate of recapturing that banded bird for songbirds is about 1.3%. So the odds aren't very good. Now, there is technology with satellite tags that will actually communicate back and forth with the satellite. So you're getting real-time tracking, like real information on their route and exactly what route they took. But those satellite tags are at least 3.5 grams, and you're not going to be strapping that on a bird that only weighs 12 to 15 grams. The ornithologists aim for trackers that are no more than 3 to 4% of the bird's mass. So then they came up with light-sensitive geolocators. So they are gathering a bit more information about banding. They only weigh about 0.5 grams. This is one on the back of a blackpoll. Very, very tiny. It is getting a bit of information that can be interpreted, but again, you have to capture them. So you're back to the same problem as banding. But if you capture them, you are going to get more information than the banding. So the big breakthrough, and I'm proud to say, as a proud Canadian, the big breakthrough was MODIS, because it was developed by Birds Canada in 2014. They use automated radio telemetry. And the genius is they're using nanotags that only weigh 0.2 to 0.3 grams, which is about 1/100th of an ounce. They're so tiny, they can put them on migrating dragonflies and butterflies. Okay, and then the data is captured by a network of over 2,000 receiving towers spread out over 34 countries. You can see it's mostly in North America. Network's expanding all the time. This is what the receiving towers look like. Some of you, I'm sure, have probably seen this. This is at Bronte Creek Provincial Park. These tags are relatively cheap, and another part of the genius is they're all broadcasting on exactly the same frequency, but they're embedded with information on the species, where it was tagged, and unique information. And then the towers are all attuned to that same frequency. So every one of those towers that goes by, it beeps and they capture the information. Another big breakthrough was the advent of dual polarization Doppler radar, weather radar. And with that, meteorologists and ornithologists can pick birds out of the weather radar and say, okay, that's not rain or hail or an ice storm or snow. Those are birds. And they can actually tell how many birds are in the air, their speed, and the direction they're going. Now, this is a really cool image. This is Lake Erie. Here's Long Point going through. And this is a so-called roost ring. So this is an estimated 500,000 swallows that were all lifted off roughly at the same time from Long Point, and they've all had to spread out because they don't want to fly into each other, and they're starting to migrate. So then some very smart guys in 2018 started to compile all the relevant historic radar data that was appropriate enough to be useful, and they compiled it and analyzed it to see which nights had mass migration historically. Okay, and what was the weather that night? What was the wind? What was the air temperature, the air pressure? And can we use that to predict when there will be mass migration? And it took the advent of cloud computing and artificial intelligence to make it work. They call it birdcast. And basically, their mathematical model will take our weather forecast and they can predict several days out and say there's going to be huge migration here, but not there. And they produce maps like this. This is a dream for birders. And I went into their website, and here's the link to it. This will be in your handout. And I just arbitrarily picked a day in mid-May last spring. And their estimate was there going to be 402 million birds on the march that night. In particular, coming up from Texas and heading right up towards Slender Bay and up into the Sioux over Lake Superior. You could have up to 2 million birds an hour going overhead while you're sleeping. Now, unfortunately, our radar technology is a little bit different than the States, and our density coverage is not as good as theirs. So they're working to integrate our data, radar data, with theirs. It's coming, but right now it looks like the world ends at the Canadian border. Now, all of this work tracking birds is not all work. Some of it's kind of fun. And Jennifer Ackerman, I've recommended her book before, The Bird Way. She tells a really hilarious story about trackers in the San Francisco area. They had geolocators on some gulls, and they couldn't understand why this one gull in the morning, it was going 100 kilometers an hour. It crossed over the Bay Bridge. It followed exactly along the interstates. And then at the end of the day, it retraced its route at 100 kilometers an hour, crossed the interstates, crossed the bridge. Turns out it was a gull getting a ride on a garbage truck and going to an organic composting facility. Now, I want to go through a of the different sort of Guinness Book of World Record champions in different migration categories. And we'll start with which bird makes the longest annual journey. And the winner is the Arctic tern. Kudos to my son Trevor. He and I were up in Iceland and he took this picture. So they migrate from their breeding grounds in Greenland and Iceland all the way to Antarctica. And so depending on the route they take, they're flying 70 to 90,000 kilometers a year. Now, they have a long lifespan for birds. They can live up to 30 years. So a tern that makes it that long will have flown up to, say, 2.5 million kilometers, like to the moon and back 3 times. So not only have they avoided winter, they're probably getting more sunshine than any other animal on the planet because they're getting 24-hour daylight at both poles. The next category is who has the longest non-stop flight. We already saw the black-polled warbler, 80 hours. That was pretty impressive. Well, the winner is a shorebird called the barred-tailed godwit. And they breed in Alaska, but they spend their winters, our winters, in New Zealand and some on the east coast of Australia. And the winner was this youngster. He was banded as B6. You can see the band on his leg. So now his parents left early, like I talked about. They left in late August. They doubled their weight and off they went. So little B6 left on Alaska. Here's his route. He left on October 13th and he arrived in Tasmania on October 24th. So in those 11 days, that bird flew 13,500 kilometers, 11 days and 1 hour. No stop for rest or for food. He averaged 1,231 kilometers per day. Amazing. Who migrates at the highest level? And that goes to the bar-headed goose. They breed on the Tibetan Plateau, in Mongolia and China, but they overwinter in India and Myanmar, which means they have to get by the Himalayas. They've been documented flying over the Himalayas at altitudes of up to 8.8 kilometers. And at that height, the effective oxygen level is only a half to a third at sea level. And of course, the air pressure is so low, they're not getting much lift. So they have to flap an awfully hard to get any lift. They've made a number of physiological adaptations to make this possible. And that could be the subject of a whole talk. Now, the hazards. I've already said migration is extremely dangerous. We know lots don't make it. It's the most dangerous time of the year. They not only do they, need good ground here, good ground at the end, they need stopover sites where they can refuel. And here are some of the hazards they face along the way: habitat loss, building collisions or wire collisions, extreme weather, and predation, especially by cats. Lights are a problem, city lights. I mentioned that they're navigating with the stars. Well, if you've got a lot of artificial lights and it's drowning out the sky and they can't see the stars, that's a problem. And nobody seems to know why, but birds are like moths. They do get drawn towards artificial light. And once they do, they tend to not want to leave it. And depending on their altitude when they're flying, they can be drawn and attracted to city lights from 200 kilometers away. And you don't want them landing in the middle of a city because it's just a very dangerous place for them to be. And a great example of this is New York City's 9/11 tribute in light. I've shown this one before. But when the lights went on, you can see this was in 2010. It looks like a bunch of bugs in the light. These are all birds. And within 20 minutes of the lights going on, they had something like 16,000 birds had crammed into a 500-meter radius. They were at a density of 150 times normal. And once the lights went off, they dissipated very quickly. So New York City, Audubon, now called New York City Bird Alliance, they have an agreement with the folks that run this tribute that they monitor it. And if there's more than 1,000 birds trapped in the light beams, the lights go off until they dissipate. Building collisions is a really big problem. Birds can't perceive glass as an object. All they see is a reflection of habitat, vegetation, trees, clouds, the sun, and they just fly right into it. And we've all witnessed a bird glide into our back window, but we see it sitting on our back porch, and oh, and it shook itself off and flew away, and we go, phew, it made it. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but about 60% of those birds fly off and die somewhere else. Only about 40%. If they didn't die on the spot, the ones that fly off, only about 40% survive. And the estimate in Canada and the US is over 1 billion a year. Birds die like this. So the easiest fix is to put on a commercially available bird safe window treatment. Feather friendly is a great one. And just so you're aware that the standard is the dots can't be any more than 2 inches apart. And then the birds recognize a solid surface and they can't fly through those dots. Another organization you should check out, and again, this will be in your handout, it's called FLAP Canada, Fatal Light Awareness Program. They do really good work. Habitat loss is a big problem. It's one thing for us to worry about protecting their habitat here, but what if those pampas in Argentina? What if they're being paved under for urban expansion? We have to worry about we have to worry about their stopover sites in between. Imagine making a trip, hundreds, thousands of kilometers, and say this Canada goose, you come back and your marsh has been drained for urban expansion. One good thing with that radar I was showing you with that roost ring, that data can detect, thousands of birds lifting off. So if there's that many birds lifting off in one area, obviously that's a very important roosting site for them. So that can be identified and then, flagged as an area to focus conservation, preservation of that area. Climate change is probably the biggest problem for birds. It affects everything, from wind, precipitation, their habitats, their food supply, diseases. 100-year floods. It seems that we get a 100-year flood every year or two now. Weather's becoming more extreme. So as the climate changes, the bird populations are expected to shift poleward or elevation go higher, trying to keep them in their ideal temperature range. And birds that don't migrate and are there year round, they're probably better equipped to survive extreme climate change because if things are happening earlier in the spring, well, they're here, they just start breeding earlier when the food's available. The problem is those obligate long distance migrants that we've talked about. They're on that hardwired schedule coming from South America. They're going to be late. And the problem with birds, it's a real balancing act to get to their breeding ground. The males race north because they want to get the prime territory. You get the best ground and you're going to get the best girl and have the most babies and, reproduction success. But if they're too anxious and they get too far north too soon and a cold snap comes, they might freeze or starve. But if they're too late, they're missing that huge explosion of protein. And right now, studies have shown that leaf out and the subsequent caterpillar peak are advancing at 3 times the pace that birds are able to adapt, those long distance migrants. So as a result, they're getting more and more out of sync with the food they need. For example, to raise and fledge 4 chicks, they need something like 6,000 caterpillars. So if they've come past the peak, the babies got just not enough food to raise them all. So what can you do to help? Well, keep your own external lights off during migration if you don't need them. And there's 2 reasons for that, or keep them off all the time if you don't need them. It's one to prevent building collisions, and also you don't want to lure in migrating birds. Push your city council to turn off the lights. Leaves the leaves in the fall. They're full of bugs. They're full of bird food. Have a bird-friendly garden. Birds will selectively choose dark red or purple berries in the fall for their fat content and the antioxidants. Don't let your cat roam. Cat predation of birds is the #1 cause of human-related bird mortality in North America. It's 100 to 200 million birds per year in Canada. It's estimated to be about 2.4 billion birds in the United States, thanks to roaming cats. And treat your windows with feather friendly, like I recommended. Now, in terms of bird advocacy, I'm co-chair of a little team called Birdsong Hamilton. We were the first to participate in the development of Hamilton's new green building standards. And we work with our local councillors to try to make our Hamilton in particular bird friendly. Always looking for volunteers, particularly, Hamilton residents, because that way, if we can get someone from every ward, then we have someone that can chase their own councillor. And it's always better to have a constituent going after their councillor. Follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, our website. And again, this will be in your handout. The Bird Friendly Hamilton team are doing fantastic work. In 2022, they managed to get the bird friendly certification for both Hamilton and Burlington from Nature Canada, who are running this program. We were the 6th and 7th cities to do so. They got recertified in 2024. The work is never done. You have to keep going. Again, follow their activity on their social media. And again, these links will be in your handout. Now, this looks like a busy graph, but it's actually quite entertaining and it's simple. So this is just frequency in the y-axis. X is the calendar year. The different colored lines are just a bunch of different warbler species. It doesn't matter. It's just a joke for birders that this is the best time of year right here, and then all of a sudden it's over, and there's like no easy way to say this. You're here, party's over. So this is the big peak of spring migration, roughly mid-May, early May, mid-May. And knowing those birds are migrating at night every morning during that spike as a birder, you wake up and you're like a kid wondering what Santa and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy all at the same time. What did they bring me? And there actually is something instructive in this slide besides just a joke. But you see the spring spike is quite tight because it's a mad dash north. You can see fall migration is more leisurely, it's more drawn out. Not quite the panic. Now, migrant traps are great places for birding. So these are the first points of land when you cross water or small patches of forest along the shorelines of the Great Lakes. Lake Erie has 3 fantastic ones. Long Point is the largest freshwater sand spit in the world and one of the most important migratory places for birds in North America. Rondo and Point Pelee are all fantastic. You note that Lake Ontario doesn't have those sort of shortcuts that migrating birds will take. So they may cross, but they may come around it as well. And then in detail, there's some nice migrant traps right around through the Golden Horseshoe. And, they're like a little oasis in the urban jungle. And, and one dictionary definition of the word oasis is a calm, pleasant place in the middle of somewhere busy and unpleasant. And so the birds seek these out. And of course, because they are small woodlots or conservation areas, the birds are highly concentrated. So during spring migration in particular, you can see a lot of birds. So here's some of my favorite places. I mean, there's more on here, but I didn't want to make the map too messy. Again, you'll get that. In terms of some recommended further reading, these are 2 fantastic books. The one on the left by Scott Weidensaul. Now, this is really focused on the birds and their migration. Rebecca Heisman's book is more on the technology and the ornithologists and the techniques and how they do the tracking. So they come at it from 2 different angles, and they're both really good reading. If you're interested in the snowy owl eruptions, there's Project Snowstorm, a play on their banding code, because their banding code is snow for the first 2 letters of snowy and owl. And you can see owls erupting right in Burlington. Here's one at LaSalle Marina out on the pier that I saw one winter. Other additional information, if you found that fascinating about seeing the magnetic field and the quantum birds, this was a very good podcast I listened to. Birds Canada has a wealth of information. And there's a website called Journey North, which is really cool. And they track not all species, but a number of species. And you can go every day and see, here they come. You can see, okay, the Orioles are now in Florida, now they're, and see them coming up closer and closer to us. A little shameless promotion, if you want to get into birding or read about birding as a form of wellness for your health, my book, it's available local bookstores of Wild Birds Unlimited. And I'm actually giving my so-called bird talk next week in Guelph for those that are interested or that are there. So I would really like to thank Kale and Burlington Green, and I really encourage the audience to donate, make a charitable donation. They're doing amazing work, and it's never been more important to contribute some dollars and keep them going. And likewise with Birds Canada, they are a national charitable organization. They're a nonprofit. They have thousands of donors. They've got 70 dedicated staff, top ornithologists, and so another place for your donation dollars. So I hope when you see our birds returning this spring, just stop and think about what they have gone through and they've accomplished. Like when I was blessed with this indigo bunting coming to my feeders, and thinking, where have you been, little one? Where were you in the winter? And you could have been in all the way to northern South America. I try to post a daily bird on my social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. All is the birder Bob. If you have any questions or a mystery bird and you want some help with it, happy to answer an email. So I thank you all for attending. I wish you safe travels. Get yourself in formation like these geese trying to get their V going by switching seats here. So that's it for the formal part of the presentation. So Caleb, if it's okay, I'll just segue into the few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So just noting for the folks, I did pop a message into the chat. It's 8:18, but we're gonna extend it until 8:30 and hopefully have some time for some questions. And just another word of thanks to everyone who's joining us. And for anyone who has to pop out, this recording will be uploaded in full to our YouTube channel, so you can catch the end if you happen to miss anything, but we will be extending at least for 12 minutes to try and get some questions in. So fantastic, and right back to you, Bob.
Okay, thanks, Cal. So one of the questions was, how has migration changed over the last 10 or 20 years? And this is a really great question because it's changed in many ways. First off, there's a lot fewer birds. We've lost 2.9 billion birds since 1970 in North America, about 30% less birds than when I was a kid. Another change is migration is becoming increasingly more hazardous because of climate change. Storms are not only more frequent, but they're more intense. There's greater extremes in temperatures. There's that risk I've already talked about arriving in the boreal forests after the peak insect supply. And so some birds aren't even migrating anymore if they can find sufficient food for the winter. The second question was, what is reverse migration and why does it happen? I saw many dead birds around Point Pelee one year. Someone said it was because of reverse migration. So reverse migration is when a bird overshoots. It basically has gone further than intended. And when it wants to correct, it turns around and heads back south. And this often happens around the Great Lakes in the spring, where a bird might cross Lake Erie and land at Point Pelee and then go, oh, and turn around and head back south. As for the comment about many dead birds, migration is dangerous and deadly, whether it's proper migration or reverse. So without the details, I can't really comment on what caused the mortality. Some birds have stopped migrating, such as Canada geese. And why is that? Well, Canada geese haven't stopped migrating. It's just that where we live here, we often have open waterways all winter, and the geese can stay here. They don't need to migrate. But I can guarantee you, ones from further north where everything's frozen, they are migrating. Some of them will come here or go further south. I live in Ancaster, and for the first time in 30 years, we have a murder of hundreds of crows flying into our backyard at sunset almost every evening throughout the winter. Is this new behavior here? Well, it's not new behavior. Crows have communal roosts, or where they get together to congregate to rest at night. They roost together in the winter, but it's just that they will move those roosts around from place to place. So yes, it's maybe a new roost in Ancaster. I'd love to know where it is actually. And then I think this is the last one that I dealt with here. I would love to hear about robins, cardinals, if they normally nest in my backyard. Can we feed them? If yes, is it safe so it doesn't disrupt their natural life? Well, first off, robins aren't feeder birds as they eat mostly insects, berries, earthworms, but you can certainly feed your other yard birds like cardinals, chickadees, blue jays, goldfinch. And I think I've already addressed this. You won't be disrupting their natural life. And birds never take more than about 50% of their diet from feeders. They will always take a lot of natural food. So my suggestion is go to Wild Birds Unlimited in Burlington or Urban Nature here in Ancaster and ask for their expert help in buying food, what kind of feeders to get, depending what birds you want to attract. Now, having said that robins aren't feeder birds, I must, full disclosure, I did have this young robin coming to my Oriole feeder a few summers ago, and it was stealing the great jelly that's out for the Baltimore Orioles. And hot off the press was 4 days ago, this adult robin started to frequent my tray feeder and eating the seeds from it. And I suspect that's because of the current cold snap where the ground is really frozen and probably it's just a lot easier to get seeds from the tray. But I mean, normally robins aren't feeder birds. So again, thank you everyone for your interest and in attendance. Leave you with this pair of beautiful bluebirds. And I'll stop sharing the screen now, Kale.
Beautiful. If you don't mind, I'm gonna just share a couple of questions that came up earlier in the chat. And we have, I believe you might have touched on them, but I want to make sure if there's any more information. So from Jean, we have two questions. And the first one, will migratory birds return to the same feeders?
To the same feeder? I believe so. I believe so. If we could see them as individuals, if they had some unique marking or like an aberrant feather, a white feather or something, so we say, okay, that's Sam or that's Fred. I suspect we would see some are back, but just bear in mind that 50-50 rule for the adults. The odds of making it back aren't great to start with, but if they can, I think so. Okay.
Awesome. Next question is, why do male red-winged blackbirds return well before the females?
Just stake out their territory. They come back and duke it out to get the best area on the marsh, and then the females come and don't like yours. Well, yours is okay. They do a little survey and pick the one they like. That's a good
Excellent.
question.
Great question. So this is more of a statement, but someone was saying that they were confused because they see blue jays all year round.
Another good observation. Blue jays are a bird that migrate, and yet they're here as permanent residents. So basically what they're doing is they all shuffle a little bit south. So the blue jays you're seeing in the winter are not necessarily the same individuals you're seeing in the summer. We may be getting birds in the winter from Timmins, and ours have gone to Ohio or somewhere. They've shuffled a little bit south.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Bob. I'm going to hop back onto my shared screen here. And Bob did share this already on his own pages, but just another shout out that Bob is an excellent person to follow. And he gave his links, which someone had mentioned or just asked about, and a reminder that we will be sending out all of Bob's slides, as well as the question and answers and the recording to the video to the email address that you registered for this webinar for. And just a reminder that Amy had popped into the chat. We will put it in the follow-up email as well, but we also have recordings of all of Bob's previous presentations on our YouTube page, and highly encourage everyone to check them out. Every single one of them is excellent, jam-packed with so much awesome information available for free. So check it out, share it with your friends. And just a quick highlight of some of our events that are upcoming, and maybe without going into detail on all of them, I'm just going to pop a link into our chat here, which has our spring opportunities page. And that has a list of all of these different events that are coming up. So very briefly, we have our citywide cleanup, which is launched already right now. You can sign up for cleanups, pick your location, get some free supplies, help to clean up our beautiful city. We have a beautiful Earth Day event at the beach on April 19th that is free and fantastic and great for the whole family. We have a guided walk as a part of it. Our native plant sale is live, and you can get some pollinator-friendly plants. We have a tree planting on April 26th that has a few spaces left, so definitely get in there if you would like to plant some trees with us. We have another event on Saturday, May 3rd, where we're doing a guided bird walk, actually at 8 in the morning, with some cleanup activities, a pollinator-friendly nature walk, and we are hosting our, I believe it's our 8th zero waste drop-off event this spring with our partners at Tech Genius, and you can drop off any of your e-waste items. We also have a partnership with the Repair Cafe, where you can bring some items to get repaired. And we just have so many things that are happening with our organization all the time. So please connect with us on all of our social media platforms, thanking our wonderful sponsors and supporters from Cogeco and the City of Burlington for helping us host this event as part of our Nature Friendly Burlington program, as well as an offering to our youth network. And like Bob said, if you are have the capacity to make a donation to our organization, we are a registered charity, and we put every single penny that we receive to really great use, helping to protect and conserve the beautiful environment that we are so lucky to enjoy, always looking for volunteers. And in our post-event email, we will be asking for your feedback. So please share your honest feedback about the event, any suggestions, thoughts, critiques. We welcome them. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us, follow up with us, connect with us on any of those things. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And another huge thanks to Bob for sharing his expertise and his passion. And I think I found a new favorite bird, the indigo bunting. It's so cute and beautiful.
Thanks, Cal, and thanks everyone for attending.